to go. All right, so another week, another episode of our podcast.
Yeah, so we're on a roll. It looks like we have several guests lined up the next couple of weeks, and we want to take time today to welcome Matt Swanson, who is the creator of Boring Rails, which is a collection of Ruby on Rails content aimed at building more with less, and Slotback Labs, which is a Canadian Football League stats and analytics tool for daily fantasy sports. Matt, in your day job, you are a lead product engineer, right?
Yeah, I'm a lead product engineer at SCP, which is where Courtney, you and I met almost 10 years ago now.
Mm-hmm. And so Matt also has a wonderful blog. Matt is a great, I consider him a high quality content creator. His blog touches on a lot of different soft skills for engineers, as well as design, and just as well as like Matt's kind of just thinking of how to build products. So that's kind of why we have you today on the show. We want to see what you're thinking in this current climate and kind of see how your career has developed. I think one angle we like to talk about on the show is how can we help young, aspiring engineers, designers, and product managers. So I think you have some really good stuff that you can share today about that angle as well.
Yeah. I think it's really an interesting time just in terms of new folks entering the industry. I think I heard or read somewhere recently that at least for software developers, it's grown by, it's basically doubled every, 2 years or something like that. So people that are in the field now, like half of the people were not here 2 years ago. So everybody is kind of reliving that same like years 0 to 5, journey that you and I were sort of on together, Courtney, and now we're kind of past that and sort of looking back and reflecting on, now we've made it through. What might we share with newer people?
How can we kind of strip down the pitfalls that we, the things that we learned through failure or like through just kind of having to slog through it? I think that's the one thing that really touched me about Boring Rails is because I think 10 years ago when you were building Rails projects, I remember you lamenting like, man, this has to be easier. And a lot of the tools and content that you have there today, like gets rid of the cruft and focuses on like, this is what you need to get started with Rails and like Redis or even just using, I know you're actually involved with like Tailwind, like setting up a design system to help you build great products, get all this technical stuff out of my way and let me actually build something. And Dan, this is kind of where you're at too, right? Get out of my way. Let me build the thing.
Oh yeah, I think that's kind of that's what I'm curious about talking to people that kind of follow the same philosophy of, we're at the end of the day, the most impactful managers, designers, engineers are those that get essentially the freedom to build. Like at the end of the day, like if you're not spending most of the stuff in meetings and you just get to build stuff, that's what I'm after.
Yeah.
So Matt, what was the, I guess, backstory on Boring Rails? Again, I kind of want to start with that because I think that's been like your main project here recently, side project.
Yeah. Well, I think it all kind of starts with something I sort of made an intentional decision on back in 2019, which was I kind of looked and stepped back and said, hey, I've been building little side projects and one-off things just because I like making. I like Den said, I like just building stuff. And I kind of looked back and I said, well, I've done all these small little things and I've had some, minor successes and a lot of things that fizzled out and didn't go anywhere. And I tried to think about like, I felt a little bit sad in a way that I didn't really have more to show from it. So I kind of tried to reframe things for myself in terms of like building assets instead of building side projects. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be something that makes money, but I was more thinking about something where I could put in some time and then it could either, grow on its own or just something that would have kind of lasting power. So, in the past, I would say like, oh, I'm really excited about this technology. I'll, make a little app in it, but I never took it all the way to, let's get customers and let's charge money for this, or let's turn it into a business. So then at the end of it, you're kind of, obviously you have the lessons you learned and you can use that in the future, but I didn't really have anything at the end that was like, oh, well, I invested time in this and now I have, something for it. So actually,
And on your
Hey, go ahead.
site, you have so many examples of this, right? Like your content has been generated through those experiments and little things you built like along the way. I actually love going back in time a little bit and looking at some of the projects you built. I remember one that really stuck out to me was the morale app. You built an application that basically would kind of monitor the morale of a team, like inside your
Yeah.
company. And like that to me at the time was pretty cool. Like as a manager, I could see that being useful. Um, but again, like you said, it's like, well, I'd have to go find customers and kind of.
Yeah. And I think each time I kind of take an at bat with this, I sort of, I really like learning something new. And so, like in that project, a lot of it was learning more about design, learning more about, how do you get customers, how do you do marketing for this type of thing. And technically, it wasn't very interesting. I mean, the bulk of the app was that every day it sends you an email with 3 links, and you click on a link, and it records yellow, red, or green for your day, and puts a little smiley face on there. Um, but that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was like, okay, what's the experience of doing this? How can I make this low friction? And this was kind of before sort of Slack had taken over, and there was Slack bots and things like that. And then from there, it was how do I get people on my team to use this? How do I get other teams at our company to use this? How do I get other companies outside of SCP to use this? And yeah, I think it was definitely a good learning experience. In some ways, it helped me figure out things that I wasn't good at or that I didn't want to do, which was a lot of the I think after that project I said, like, I never want to be a product manager. Like I just I don't like
That's
I don't like
fantastic.
the like administration and roadmap management and emailing customers and all that.
Dan, I'm curious to hear
You
your
know,
rebuke to that because you went from being a developer to a
yeah,
manager.
but
So
no, it's a very good point. I think the sentiment is very much the same. Like to me, my passion is more about kind of building things, right? Like when I talk about what is my career goal in 10 years, right? And we talk about 10 years as this like ephemeral timeline, but like I want to be a CTO, right? Because I want to be deeply in the technical stack. I want to build stuff, right? Things like let's analyze kind of the revenue projections. Like, yes, you have to do it for a product, but if I have to choose, I would always lean towards building. But to that extent, actually, Matt, I'm curious, and trying to take a step back. You mentioned time for side projects, that you kind of started these. How do you find that time when, say, you have a full-time job? Because I think one of the conversation points that I have with my mentees is sometimes they ask the same thing, where I'm coding all day at my day job.
Yeah.
Like, am I expected to come home and then code more on my own projects? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I think early on I actually am sort of a bad example in that I didn't really have a good balance for that. And I think early on I even kind of distinctly remember like looking at other coworkers and like, oh, like they're not doing anything extra. Like this is wrong, this is bad. And obviously as you get older and start thinking a little bit more outside yourself and realize that other people have other things going on and other things pulling for your time, you certainly can kind of look back and cringe a little bit at past you. But I don't know. I've always had success when I can kind of find some overlap in what I'm doing. So right now, for me, at my day job, I've been able to work on a Rails app for the past 2 years. So that kind of dovetails, and there's some overlap there where I can work on learning a new technique, apply it in my day job, and then maybe on the weekend I'm summarizing that into a blog post and kind of generalizing it. And that's been hard for me, especially in my world. Like I work, doing custom software consulting for, medium sized companies. So a lot of times I don't have necessarily control over the tech stack we're using or what's right for the business. It's more about solving problems for the business instead of, well, I want to go learn, this new JavaScript framework or that. And I think you can see that some in some of my writing. Like for a while, I was doing a lot of Android work, and so I, in my side projects then were, hey, I'm going to write about Android, and I was really big into doing test-driven development, and there was kind of a gap in mobile applications and test-driven development didn't really kind of go together. You had kind of this spirit of of, somebody in their garage trying to make a $1 million app, and then you have, compare that to
TDD like framework.
PDD and and the software as a craft movement and that sort of thing. So I mean, I started something down that path, and it kind of fizzled out, and then I was at work moving on to something else, and it just becomes I definitely then emphasize with your mentees in that it's hard to find time, especially if, like, I was often in the situation where there would be like a Ruby meetup in town, but I wasn't working on a Ruby project at work anymore. So it's sort of hard to justify and kind of know, should I do something that I think is going to help me get better at my job? Should I do something that I'm more interested in? And I've been fortunate enough that when those things overlap, I try to take advantage.
I love that you touch on, though, here something that younger engineers can kind of take away, which is like the current things that you're working on are interesting and can become content or can become thought experiments for you to talk about, and like externalizing that sometimes helps you better understand the project. But it also shows like your breadth of knowledge. I mean, like you said, you look back through your blog, and I can see like an evolution of what your tech stack was and like what you were thinking about. And that says so much about like your work history and how you approach problems. I think that's super valuable. If anybody was to come and say, hey, we want to hire Matt Swanson, what was his history? It's all there, right? And it's all kind of cemented. And it'd be really hard 10 years from now, 10 years away, to talk about like that old Android project, right? Like, you did
for sure.
You don't remember the little things you were going through. So there's like an evolution shown there. But I also think you brought up another point, which we all feel as professionals, which is how much hustling should I be doing outside of my job to get better? And I think that there's this nuanced balance of like, you got to find something enjoyable outside of work to continually drive you. Like you need to be keenly interested in maybe a very specific tech or like getting a certain thing done. I.e., for me, it's just understanding design. And for you, it sounds like it's like focusing on like this Rails problem and like helping build projects. But kind of where I'm going with this is I've felt that pressure where it's like, should I be doing so much outside of work, or do I need to just kind of take work for work and I do it just to be basically free me up to do all the other things I'm interested in outside of tech?
This is I like 100% that, and I feel like there's tremendous value in what I would refer to as coding for fun, right? This is where back in the days when I was first starting at Microsoft, I worked with Clint that we interviewed, Brian Peak, Dan Fernandez, and they had this project on Channel 9 called Coding for Fun, where literally the projects they would build were like, a Twitter bot for World of Warcraft, right? Or like boxing robots, where you can kind of overlap, and this is what Matt was alluding to, like how can you find a job that overlaps with that ability to learn and build, so that you're not necessarily separating the two, but seeing that as I'm just doing fun stuff all the time, or like stuff that allows me to grow even at my job.
Yeah, I think it's obviously great if you can have some overlap, and I don't know, it really is just such a complicated subject. I know there's in the industry, there's a whole crowd of people who will say that the 40-hour week is sacred, and but then there's other people that also would say that, and then say do as I say, not as I do. It's easy to espouse this low stress work environment, when to get to that position you actually had to work 80-hour weeks to then build up either reputation or your capital. So yeah, I don't have a great answer, and it's something it's something that I think is really not clear cut.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're kind of getting to a very interesting point where when folks that get into the more senior positions, it's very easy to say, balance your time, find ways to kind of relax. And so that's great. But at the same time, a lot of those folks got to those senior positions because they, spend a significant amount of time, say, working after work on their side projects. They had the luxury of the fact that they could sit down and code on some awesome stuff that they demonstrated. Then they were not just kind of, turning their computer off. So it's definitely tricky. I don't know if there's a single recipe, and I don't know, like when people ask, like, well, should I balance my work week? You probably should. But at the same time, how do you also balance with the fact that you do need to grow your skills? You do need to learn new things and kind of constantly improve yourself. I don't think I ever found the answer.
Matt, I'm curious, like when you were early on in your career, I know I was kind of familiar with you being really involved in like the Indie Startup Lab, helping around the Indianapolis area, like with different technology projects and going out and meeting people. Those are great activities, but when it comes back around to just like basically setting up your learning list, right? Like, did you have like a kind of a path in mind, as a software engineer, where you wanted to go and what skills you were looking to acquire to kind of level up, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and it's hard to think back to. This is years and years ago, and it's easy to backfill a narrative of what I was doing. But I've always been interested in things like it's funny that Den mentioned the coding for fun. I definitely remember reading that blog back in the day, and I mean, when I think about the stuff that I work on, I don't think I've ever been one to strictly say like I want to learn this tool, so I'm going to like do a bunch of tutorials about it. It's always been sort of project based for me, and sometimes those projects were less personally interesting. I remember like I built a Stack Overflow clone once to learn how to use a different database or something, and obviously like there's nothing there that's too interesting. It's I was really treating it more like a to-do list app or something. But then there's been other times when I've built things, fantasy football tools for my own use, or the morale app was a tool for us to use at work, and now some of the stuff I'm doing with Boring Rails is more about producing content and things that are more interesting to me.
Yeah, there's definitely one of those areas where it's when I think about coding for fun, I also think of like working on the most seemingly insignificant things just to learn things. So just like you, like I don't think I've ever set out to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to learn Python and just be good at Python. Like my hobby project in the past couple of days, and my wife,
right? Like
my wife has been laughing at me, but I have this little light. It's called a blink light. And essentially, it's an LED that can react to, if you have Slack or Microsoft Teams and you set your status, it kind of changes the light. So I was like, you know what? I'll figure out how to sniff the USB traffic and see how I can set the light myself from Python. Like, it's totally useless. It's not something that I can start a startup from. It's not a business, but it's fun. And it's fun to learn because, like, okay, now I know how to, look at the USB traffic. And I found a open source contributor on GitHub, Eric O'Shaughnessy, who, I had some questions. They just email me and I'll tell you exactly how I found my solution to this. It's fantastic because it has no point whatsoever other than like, this looks fun and I'm curious how to do this.
Yeah. But then if you really think about it, it's like, oh, well, you're getting experience, just playing around with IoT and what are some of the patterns there. And you've a dirty word, but you've networked with this person who in the future you may need to reach out and do something with. So yeah, and I think people are drawn more to projects anyways. If things that I see on Twitter, it's always hey, I'm making this thing, here's some screenshots of it. I think that always gets people's attention more than I wrote a tutorial on this this module or on this version of this library.
Oh, yes, there's so much of that where it's so much when you go to sites like Hacker News. I think that's why I love the fact that Hacker News does some curation where, if I have a tutorial on, how to use Flask in 10 steps, like, I don't know, versus somebody saying like, I figured out how to use Flask to control my Pokemon Go app. And I was like, whoa, okay, I want to read that. That's like, sure.
I just don't know how they control their Pokemon Go app. And then I don't really care what the tech stack is. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think the older I've gotten, the more I've gotten just like totally, I don't really care what the stack is. Does it work? And like, how is it making like a delightful product?
How
do we get to that sweet spot of like, the tech team isn't mired in technical decisions, like getting slowed down in that slog of choosing what tools to use. And Matt, this is your area, man. This is like your lead product engineer. So how do you How do you do that with your team today? Like, make clear
Yeah.
decisions, move the product forward, and make it a good product. And we're not talking about code, TDD and all that good stuff. Like, code quality is really important, but also at the end of the day, you have to be delivering value.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's so interesting to think about the context too. I mean, in my day job, like we're working in kind of like high complexity, high cost of failure business domains. So for me, when I'm picking tools, I almost need the tools to be like a given that I can deliver with something. So that leads me to pick things that I think I'm more familiar with, that I think a broader range of developers are more familiar with. That tends to be things that are a little bit older. They've sort of stood the test of time, and you've been able to use time as a filter, right? If something's been around for 10 years, it's likely to still be around for 10 years. If something has been around for 3 months, then it's just has less. It's been exposed to less stressors, and may not be there when you come and try to revisit this in 6 months. So I think there's a good mental model for this. I wouldn't say that I explicitly use it, but I like the idea of like the innovation token, which is sort of you have a fixed amount of tokens that you can use for fancy new technology. So if you're gonna do a project and you want to spend your currency on a new database, okay, but then everything else needs to be kind of tried and true tools.
What criteria do you apply to that new technology, say you're a new database, to actually see if it works for the scenario? Because I feel like oftentimes talking to folks in the engineering field, there's this tendency of like, hey, there's a new shiny thing, let's just throw all our resources into it, let's go with it. And then halfway through the project, you realize like, oh, this actually doesn't scale as well as it should. What's your process of assessing whether it's even a good decision to go with that innovation token?
Yeah, and I think it really also just depends on context too. So I can share some of my context, and that's going to be different than Dan where you work, and Courtney where you work, and where somebody listening to this is working. But like in my context of, I also have the additional lens of consulting and things like that, where we also need to think about after we've left the project, how easy is this going to be for our customers to maintain? What skills do they have internally? What if they don't have anybody, like how hard is it to hire somebody to do this, right? And if you're using something bleeding edge, you may actually be able to hire people because it is new shiny and people want to work on it, but maybe the cost is higher, and somebody who is using all the latest shiny tools may be someone who's more likely to be drawn to that and want to switch around, and if you're looking for someone to maintain a system for long term, like you kind of want something that's a little more boring. And so like layer that on with the actual context of a project, and now you can suddenly see how this is sort of becoming an overwhelming list of factors, and it becomes more of an art than a science. But yeah, figuring out what do I actually have this problem? Do I have a problem this is solving, or is this something that I hope? I mean, you mentioned scale. Scale is obviously important, but there's a huge spectrum of scale. The project I'm working on right now is never going to have 100 users, let alone 100,000 users. It's an internal like line of business tool. So you have to really weigh all of that against these tools and see what are they actually giving you.
Yeah, I love the idea of there's the memes floating around the kind of the overcomplicating of the process when oh, I have an independent bookstore that I need to have a site for, like let's throw Kubernetes on it and like all this stuff. Yeah. Like it literally can be a static site that can be 2 HTML pages. That's it. Like you need nothing else.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, I understand, and I think it's a really complicated reason as to like how this happens in the industry, right? So if you think about it, there's just these larger tech companies they have so much influence in the market. There's so much money, prestige, recognition, and a lot of the problems they have are just completely different than what I don't even know what the breakdown would be, but let's say the other 90% of the industry, right? So I'm interested in both of your takes on this, since I think you both have worked at these bigger firms in the past. And like, if you think about it, there's kind of two angles that this stuff comes from. I think there's when you get to a certain scale, you have certain problems that are not solved by existing tools. You also have a huge bandwidth for developing solutions that will fit, combined with any incremental benefit you can get can have huge leverage in terms of profitability and scale. So that's where a lot of the R&D is happening. And then you turn it around, like, which organizations also have money to spend on developer advocacy and sponsoring conferences and doing all this. And then you flip it the other side. You've got all these new people entering the industry. They see the lure of these companies. And I'm not saying it's like predatory or anything. It's like, these are the apps everyone is using, right? Like, if you're a new developer, you're like, wow, it would be awesome to work at Twitter. Like, I use Twitter all the time. Like, Gmail is my favorite app. That's so cool. And these companies also are sort of the winners in the market. They can pay top salaries. So it leads to this kind of cycle where people that are new are interested in learning these technologies because they're important to have on your resume to get hired at these companies that they're aspiring to work for. And everybody else is, I think, just kind of left in this weird middle ground where, like, Dan, you're saying, like, yeah, why does a small business need like a Kubernetes cluster? And it's like, well, they don't. But the people that are working on it are like, well, one day I dream of working at Microsoft doing this, and Microsoft has legitimate reasons for needing this. It creates this really weird dynamic that I think it's not good. But I understand how it happens.
Like, the tech stacks in some instances, and we're talking in generalizations here, but in some instances they're chosen because of the personalities on the team.
Yeah, and like what their goals are.
Aspirational goals.
Right. And to that extent, I think there's another factor where once you become so kind of entrenched in working with certain tools, like, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But sometimes you got to realize that, to put a nail in the wall, you don't need a freaking bulldozer. You just need a little hammer, right? But I feel like when folks get so deep into this technology stack, say, like, Matt, you're talking about folks in kind of the developer advocacy space, the engineers, when you work, day in, day out, would say, like, a Docker, for example. Well, of course, everything is going to look like something that you can put, use Docker for. And, because why not? Like, it's easy, it's scalable, it works really well. It's a good tool. But there's very little visibility outside of that stack to say, you know what, maybe you don't need Docker for this. Maybe you need to use GitHub Pages or something like that. But I feel like the factor can also be the fact that it's just folks do it all the time. They're comfortable with it. To them, this is, it doesn't seem complicated. I've been working with Docker for 10 years or however long Docker existed, and I can just throw together a Docker file, put some commands on, bam, it works. But when you put it to somebody that's new in the industry and they have no experience with Docker, no experience with containers, and they look at it and say, like, I have no idea what this does. Like, why? Like, what's a sidecar? Like, why do I need this? Why? Like,
and so the last couple of years, I've been approached by people that are asking, how do I get into software development? There's people that are hitting kind of ceilings in either their industry, or they see that there's a world of opportunity becoming a software developer, and they say, Courtney, like, tell me, like, what do I do to get started? What technologies do I need to do? What boot camps do I go to? Where do I go to get this knowledge? And what technologies, right? Like I said, what technologies do I have to learn? And I think there's been a couple times here recently where I've just pointed at Matt your way, because it's like, go look at what Matt's doing with Boring Rails and look at the texts he's referencing. Like, if you learn these, you would be able to build a pretty simple web app. And I'm talking like you could get started doing that, but then as complexity grows, you can figure out how to use these technologies to also build even larger apps, right? Scale up. And Matt, so I think you're in that world of like, let's get some sane defaults here, right? Like, give me some tools to start with. Like, where in the hell do I start as a junior?
Yeah, to be clear, like, even just saying sane defaults, like, you have to bring context into it. the same, a sane default for Den, if he's starting up a project with 25 engineers, is not so sane for me with 2 engineers. And that's why I think it's so tough to navigate some of this, because it really just depends so much. And I think,
as much as people hate hearing that, right?
yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of challenges, right? I mean, like, and I battle with this internally all the time, is that, like, I think like, writing is better when you don't sort of couch things with so many caveats. I think being more clear and direct, like, makes for, like, actual better, like, writing regardless of the subject, right? But then, like, is this helping contribute to the problem of losing context and subtlety and nuance? And I can say that I can also say that I think sort of this, like, identity-based technology approach, like, is probably overall harmful to the industry. But at the same time, like, am I participating in it by saying that, like, oh yeah, like, do things in Rails and everything will be fine? Like, I have the answer. And it's just really just a really messy, interesting topic to unravel in, like, the age of content creators and influencers. And you can see that seeping into the technology market. I mean, you have folks on YouTube. I don't know if you guys watching these videos. There's people that work at the, like, I'm an ex Facebook employee and I'm making YouTube videos telling you how you can get a $500,000 a year job. And then this is what people that are new to the industry are finding. This is kind of the dream that's being sold by boot camps. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It's just it feels closer to, like, winning the lottery,
right,
to get one of these jobs than the reality. There's an entire, like, huge swath of people. I think Patrick McKenzie was recently tweeting about this, of, like, you'd be surprised how many, like, small, like, $10 million a year software companies there are. It's like, thousands of times more. Like,
you talk about Rails, right? Like,
yeah.
Basecamp.
Yeah.
Like, Basecamp is one example. Like, DHH, the guy that invented Rails. Like, look at Basecamp, right? It's like, it's a small business, but it produces a significant amount of revenue.
Yeah, for sure. And there's just
Matt, where you work, you're working at a software shop. I mean, it's a large software company that helps clients that don't have in-house sometimes, or you're augmenting their in-house, right?
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say it's large, right? Like, SEP now we have 150 people. Like, that's small compared to the industry. And if you think about, if every not even major, every just mid-sized city in the country has got 5 to 10 software agencies that are doing this, like, there's just a huge number of jobs. There's a huge number of applications, businesses that are using software that just don't fit into these categories that a lot of times I think are overrepresented on the internet.
Oh yeah, and everybody paints it, and I think this is part of kind of the Silicon Valley culture, where, like, everything needs to be a unicorn, everything needs to be the $1 billion company, and if you reach $1 billion, you need to be a $10 billion company. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if you are a $1 million a year company, you're doing great. Like, it's okay to say, where we are, it's good. Our growth is sustainable. We don't need to get that kind of the exponential growth curve where it's like every year we get 50 million more users. The next year we're going to get 300 million. Like,
and I think like, having leverage is what feels good to me too. I mean, I've worked on projects where we've had a team of 3 to 5 people, and we've built apps that I think are comparable to what a company with 200 developers are making. And I'm not going to say that it's completely equivalent, but is it the 80-20 there of, is this close enough with they have 100 times the budget and staff spent on it? Is this app 100 times better? I don't think it usually is.
It's so interesting to me, Matt, because working at SEP, I knew kind of what the team sizes were, and I haven't seen a shift really in all of my jobs for the teams that I'm directly working with. Like, I'm still working with 2 to 3 engineers, maybe 1, or maybe if it's a great project, I'm working with 2 PMs at a time. I mean, the team sizes haven't scaled much in my actual, like, tactical work. It's funny because it's we're working on, like, pretty big feature sets. But in these big companies, you would think, working at Microsoft, we have these massive teams. It's like, yes, we have massive teams, but the teams are still working on. They're still getting kind of stretched thin, right? And you
Yeah.
still just have 2 or 3 guys just kind of banging away on like Microsoft documentation, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just a web site. It's a web app. And so I think, there's like also this outside image of like, oh, they have so many people thrown at it. And it's like, well, not really. And I'm sure like GitHub's the same way, right? Working on their products, it's like they might have people working on certain features, but it's still 2 to 3 people.
But it's also interesting tangentially to that is the fact that when we, from the outside, it seems like, oh, it's just a website, right? Like it's a web app. What's so hard about building a web app that shows you some static HTML? But in reality, that complexity is so abstracted out. So when folks start kind of thinking through, why do you need 10 engineers to build that? Well, let me explain to you the architecture and all that goes in it and all the scalability and all this, like somebody needs to manage
all
data.
those decisions that were made like 5 years ago when it launched. Now that technology is obscure and nobody knows what the hell's going on.
Well, and then there's like Conway's law, which is that the shape of the software sort of mirrors the shape of the organization too, and it's hard to say which is causal and which is the effect, right? Of our teams and features broken down into services and divisions like this because we have all the people, or did they break out this way because that's naturally how the software wants to go? And I think it's usually a mix of both. So the thing that I think is interesting, and I'd be curious to get your take on, we've been talking a lot about the development side, but on the design side, I kind of have this take that I think design systems are kind of falling into this same trap that we talked about. And I think, to me, I don't think I've seen this articulated much anywhere, but like design systems seem almost like an open source library to me. And from the development side, I think it would be sort of it would be surprising if I said on my project, like I'm going to write my own like database ORM. But I get the sense, and maybe this is my bubble or my own bias here, but I get the sense that like the design community is sort of moving in a way where every company, every product, every team is sort of saying like we need a design system. And when I look at this analogy, I'm like, oh well, that seems strange. Like certainly there's a need for design systems in the same way there's a need for databases, and there are companies where it makes sense to build frameworks and build your own tooling. So certainly I wouldn't say that it's absurd for Microsoft to have a design system. I think it's the opposite. Like they have many product lines and they're looking for consistency across that. But I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this, because I see a lot of movement in the direction of like, oh yeah, this is a core thing. This is a best practice. This is something that your small team needs to be doing. If you're not doing design systems, you're falling behind. And I just worry that it's kind of falling into the trap we've talked about of applying the wrong scale or the wrong context.
Yes, absolutely. And again, back to your original comment, it depends. So, within Microsoft, there is definitely this trend there. There's the Fluent UI system. That is actually the product of a central team at Microsoft. So you have a central team that's kind of dictating, here's like the direction and the visual design language we'd like to use. People across Microsoft, thousands of designers across Microsoft. But when the rubber meets the road, I'm working on a web app that we have our own design system based on like Bulma CSS library, right? Which is open source and is something that people contribute to on GitHub. So, it gets to this place where we want to create consistent products, and we want to also empower developers to more quickly spin up projects. I think there was a time in the past where it was painful to work on CSS, right? And it was painful to work with. You didn't know what the designer was going to throw over the fence next, and you had to basically talk through every single permutation of the interface. And the engineers were thinking about it more from a systems approach, I think, more so than designers, right? A lot of times designers would create bespoke designs, and then you'd get into this world of everything's a one-off. And the engineers were saying, how can we make this relationship better? When you come to us, maybe using a standard pattern, right? And making it in a way that we can all contribute to the project together. And I think that's the power of design systems. That's something that happened at Stack Overflow when we worked on stacks. It was like, it empowered the engineers to also contribute to the design conversations they could submit, issues like, hey, we need some way to like, we basically need a consistent way to like talk about card elements, right? What are cards? How do they exist in our system? How do they behave? All of that stuff. So Matt, back to your point, I think we're getting a little bit lost. Some of these systems are getting a little lost in like, well, what's our goal? Is it to create like an open source, like you said? Is our job as like the designers and the engineers on like Microsoft Docs to create an open source system that everybody can use? No, not at all. It's right now it's just to make it so it's a repeatable experience for our customers, and let's just do what makes sense from our end. Like we're not as concerned about like exposing it to the world. Whereas like you see Salesforce or Tailwind UI, right? I think you're really keen on Tailwind, Matt. Like I think that Tailwind's an awesome system. I think they're doing a lot of great things, but they're building it for a broad community, right? They're making it. It's not for like one specific product. I don't know.
And it also could be the fact that, as a typical engineering practice of nothing else makes sense. Mine will make the most sense though. And when folks just kind of, the XKCD comment that like we should create a unified standard, and like now there's 21 competing standards.
Yeah.
So it's, to me, as a non-designer, I always felt slightly overwhelmed with choosing like the right design systems for like the sites that I manage or the projects that I work on, because there's just so much, right? And everybody claims to be the best, and everybody claims to be the most scalable and the universal.
A big one in design systems is like the most semantic, right?
Right.
Like I am naming things properly, and it's like naming is so like
the most modern though, the most clean.
Yeah.
Right. Like, exactly.
Yeah. I had an hour-long conversation about the sizes of typography and what we should name them. It's like, this is a ridiculous conversation to be having right now. I feel like it should just be large, medium, and small. Like everybody in the world understands that, but apparently they don't, right? Like how semantic do we want to be? And it's like, how many cycles are being wasted on designers' time and engineers' time trying to figure out the right ways to name things?
And I guarantee that there's going to be somebody that's going to look at that and say, you know what? Large, medium, small doesn't make sense. I'll create my own that has large, somewhat medium, somewhat small, and small. And then
I'm going to convert it. I'm going to actually introduce my own variables now that are named something that makes sense to me. So the design system almost becomes a reflection of the team. Again, what Matt was saying with like the tech stack. Man, we're creating this mess that we're getting into with engineering. We're also getting into it now with like design systems. And I'm not so much on like the actual front end side of it. It's more like the actual architecture of it. How do we distribute it even can be like a point of contention, right? Like, how do we want this integrated into our project?
There's always going to be edge cases.
Like, is performance important? So it's like design versus engineering when it comes to these types of discussions. Like how much do we want to integrate animation into the stack because it increases our page load by a couple of milliseconds, right? So
it's more delightful, but it's worse for accessibility.
How do I weigh those two and compare them as value added to a customer? We can't necessarily.
I guess just overall, I'm sort of surprised that there's not more folks on the design side that are taking some of these design systems that exist that are sort of open source. So I think of things like Bootstrap, things like even things like the Atlassian style guide or a Microsoft style guide or some of these things, and saying, hey, we don't have bandwidth for 50 people that are experts on usability and doing research, but it's great that you want to share this. Like, let's take this, let's adapt it. And I feel like that's really where the actual value can be seen on some of this. Some of this weird mix of product and design, right? It's not necessarily valuable to build up a button. It's where do you put the button? What does it say? And like I think that's just a better use of time, and overall I think will probably be a more rewarding experience for somebody. Now there's certainly room for people that want to make frameworks in the developer sense, and so I think there's the same thing in the design world. There's room for people that want to sweat the details of sub-pixel font aliasing and what's the optimal rounded corner radius, right?
But you're going back to like
I just worry that
practices and like
yeah, I just worry that the best practices get, get promoted by folks that are doing that work, and then that leads people who try to sort of misapply that. The answer for a design system is not that everyone needs a design system. It's, hey, there's a benefit to having established conventions and patterns. You don't need to yourself make those patterns. You can point to these, and like maybe I would like a designer to say, evaluate these 10 design systems that are out there and pick the one that you think will fit best with the needs of our project. Is our project closer to something like Jira, so let's use the Atlassian system, or is it closer to something like Twitter, so let's use Bootstrap or some of the Twitter UI patterns?
Well, it's
I
interesting
love,
too
so
because
if you go back in time to 2008, or around the time that the iPhone was released, they did Apple did an amazing job of basically setting up one of the initial frameworks for a design system. They had their human interface guidelines, the Apple HIG, which focused, it was less on the visual representation and the like actual mechanics behind how it's created, and more on the user experience standards that they were going to push through across their system. So I'm talking like where the placement of the buttons are in a drill down list, right? Or if you're going through a wizard, having the next button on the right and the back button on the left. And so like documenting all of those like key user insights and why they made it. So they would go back to like, we did studies on XYZ and we found that for accessibility, this was a better option, right? That is where I think that there are definitely design systems out there doing some of this. And I think Atlassian has some of this in theirs, where they explain, here is the decision, and this is what our product does from an experience perspective, and here is why. Here's the insight, and that is really valuable, and that's where like the wisdom of the crowd comes in, and leaning back on past research. It's not the pattern kit, right? It's not, like you said, it's not the button design. It's not the.
But Courtney, like I think you're right. And the example that you're using is so astute here, like Apple, right? Like they have done a fantastic job at outlining the set of standards for iOS UIs. But even then, you notice that best practices become this kind of a subjective thing where folks will say, you know what, but my app is just that much different. I mean, think of how many menus we have. Like there's the hamburger menu. And then some folks say, you know what, hamburger menu, not my thing. I'm going to put a bar at the bottom. And some folks will say, you know what, I'm going to mimic Windows Phone and have this like pivot. It's even with the standards in place, there's always going to be folks that will say, I'm a special snowflake and my app should be just this much different, even though the best practices are established. I'm like, that doesn't apply to us.
There was a really controversial discussion among like the design community a while back, which was like calling design systems people that do work on this like scrapbookers. Like you're just giving people like a bunch of stickers. You're giving them a bunch of stickers and like page styles, and then you like let them go wild. So like, Aunt Jenny can make whatever like design she wants, and then mine would be totally different. So there's like this, like, you're giving them some great stuff to work with, but they're going to take all the stickers and stack them on top of each other or use them in ways you didn't intend. It's like, that's great to have the visuals and they all work together in your ideal world. But what is the actual intended guidance, right? And sometimes you just have to see examples. Like for me, I have to just see, like, give me examples of this thing in the wild. Like you can't just give me, lorem ipsum versions. I got to see real ones.
And those are evolving too. Like look at now, we went from the skeuomorphic design to flat design to what now is referred to as like the neomorphic.
Yeah.
Right. So we're like even putting a design system in place that doesn't stay the same for a long time.
Yeah, I think it just. I hate saying this word again, but it depends, right? The thing with best practices.
That's the name of this episode. It depends.
Yeah. The thing with best practices is something becomes a best practice if it is like widely useful across a lot of domains, and that tends to give you things that are like good on average, and that's fine. But if you have some part of your app or some part of your product that like you don't want to be average, like you have to not use the best practice. Like if you use the best practice, it's going to look like everything. It's going to work the same way. So same thing on the development side. Like the best practice is to use this pattern or this type of database or this data model. But if that's the core of your application, then you probably don't want to be using a best practice. If the best practice says, use a SQL database, and you have, well, we need this database to be super high performing because it's a real time analytics platform, then like you don't want to use the best practice. And I think really what I'd like to highlight on the design side is that, like, I think designers and the design community have been fighting a worthy battle to show that there's more to design and product than just the way something looks. And I think for a while that was certainly like the wrong perception, especially that maybe developers had, that you just slap a coat of paint on us, like make this look pretty, it's done. And I think there's a risk that with some of this design system stuff, designers are sort of falling back to that and de-emphasizing, they've made so many hard-fought gains into saying that there's more to it than what the button looks like. It's how it interacts with the flow and some of that. And I just worry that some of these trends are like, yeah, but we have to build a design system, gets back closer to the anti-pattern, the state where things were bad, where it was just like, yeah, the designers are over here. We gave you your book of stickers, as you were saying, your scrapbook, and here you go.
You also have this mechanic happening. I saw a little bit at Stack where it's like the team wants to be something to be proud of. Like it's almost like the system itself becomes a focal point for like effort, right? And
sure.
Like,
yeah.
So
like it's a deliverable. It's a deliverable on its own.
Work has been very closely tied usually to like a front end execution of a user experience, but the design system is something that the design team can wholly own. In the trinity of product development and product engineering, there's product design now, and they have their own thing that they're just like latching onto. So it becomes like this. It becomes a really like magnetic thing for the designers to fixate around, right? It's like, oh, we're in this together and we're collaborating around it, and maybe that's the wrong angle to take it, right? Like we're focused so much on like having something to show our value, because other things are harder to show, right? Like it's harder to show.
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy being a designer at all, especially coming up in the software world, because I don't want to minimize that. For sure, there's there's the whole mentality of like design needs a seat at the table, right? And I think that's oftentimes justified. That until recently, it wasn't really treated as equal or a valuable part of it. But it's just really hard to break into that, I think.
How do you articulate your business value sometimes comes into conversations, right? Like,
yeah,
when you go to say like, we made this experience more delightful, well, what are you using for that, right? Is that, there's been things in the past that I've tried to monitor this, but I think that's also why we're seeing like an affinity for people going, and I'm not saying this to downplay it, but I think accessibility has become a real focal point, but it's also because it's like easier for us to say, look, we improved our coverage and when it comes to accessibility, and it's integrated into our design processes, right? And it's like one more thing we have to tackle and take on as a team, a design team. Obviously, the whole product team owns it, but usually that falls into the designer and engineers realm, right?
And
we
I
work
think
together.
You're alluding, Courtney, to a very important point where any framework, any system, with it being released into the world, it should abstract out complexity, and including like accessibility is hard, right? Building an accessible web experience, mobile experience is hard. So a design system or a framework put in place should abstract that out. So whenever I use these Lego blocks, I use it not because I'm religiously following the mantra of design framework X, versus I'm building on something that reduces my need to do complex things, so I can focus on the value of the product instead of kind of reinventing the wheel over and over on these items.
Yeah, so it saves me time. It saves me a lot of time. I know that like having the Fluent library personally, like it's nice to know that that central team has already done like their due diligence on all the accessibility standards around like form fields and stuff. So I don't have to worry about those nitpicky details when I go to build an experience. It's more about going out and talking to customers and then designing something that's appropriate for them. And so I told Matt in a DM, it was like, he's like, I have a really strong opinion on design systems. I said, I really don't. Like, I just feel like at the end of the day, whatever helps our team get done faster is great. I don't want to get lost, like I said, in hour-long conversations about naming naming something that's for internal use, right?
So you must love utility CSS systems, right? Since you don't have to name anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely one of the benefits.
And then you take me and everything for me is named style 1, style 2, button style 1. That probably translates to me just not knowing CSS well enough.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's a topic definitely to think about more. And I almost wonder if some of the framing of like design needs a seat at the table just sets things up for more of an adversarial relationship that then leads people to kind of dig in and say, we want to own and have our own deliverables that we can
Right.
It's clear, right? Like a design system is clear.
You're immediately setting the stage for this tribalism to happen in this conflict versus like, let's collaborate.
Yeah.
How can we fixate on customer
And
success?
I don't know how I don't have any good really guidance on how to kind of navigate that. If you're a young designer coming up into the field, it can be hard. You almost have to like sense out whether like you're working with people that are allies of design or are going to push back and say this isn't needed. Like just make the button colors pretty.
And it depends on the culture of the team too, because in terms of, I think what also you mentioned is how your performance is measured, where everybody wants to have some sort of a deliverable, right? So if you're paid a certain amount of money, it'd be odd to say, well, okay, maybe we should just reuse something that somebody else did it, and then I don't have to do that work, and then I can focus on something else, right? Because like, no, you need to show that you're building something. So that's why the tendency is to always kind of reinvent the wheel, because like, well, I'm paid for it, so I should be building this instead of coming.
Yeah.
And it probably depends a lot on the culture, because a team that is mature should be able to identify those things and say, yeah, it doesn't make sense to reinvent those things, versus somebody that is driven primarily by, say, features. They would be always focused on like, no, let's build a new thing so I can show that I did things.
Yeah. I think it's almost like maybe there's just a misunderstanding of what like reinventing the wheel is, and like when it comes to design versus development, because I think at least for me as a developer, it's more clear to see, I think, when we're reinventing the wheel. And maybe that's just the maturity of design when it comes to technology is still in earlier days than development or something. But it feels like, yeah, if I came to Dan and said, hey, we need to write our own like database ORM for this project, like he would look at me like I
You're crazy.
was and of course not. And but I don't know, like what's the analog on the design side? If we said we need to build a design system, like, or where's the line there?
No,
I mean, I know for a fact. Like I said, I came into Microsoft, and we're using Bulma. Like we didn't want to spend time reinventing the wheel. We went out and grabbed something that we thought was going to work for our needs, and now we're having to retrofit it with the Fluent UI system, right? Like, so it's this weird mishmash. We can't use any of the central design team's code, so it just creates this like weird mess. Like some things are relying on an old version of Bulma. We can't rebase it because we've gone too far, right? Like, it just kind of creates chaos. It would have been nice just to be like, let's just use like.
It's like the sunk cost fallacy, right? Because you've invested so much time and effort into building this, nobody wants to be the person to say, let's just rip it out and replace it with something better.
Like, I don't really know of any web product right now using, like, in Microsoft, using the main Fluent like web library. Like just linking to the CDN and just using it straight up, right? Like, I don't think that's happening. Whereas like I'm sure there's thousands of projects that are just doing that with Tailwind, right? They're just going out, reaching into this utility-based framework, and
it's a little apples and oranges, right? Because one is sort of, it's kind of like what's a tool versus a framework, and I'm curious if you think that some of the usage is sort of a consequence of the organizational structure of it, right? If there's a team that just works on a design system versus teams that are working on the products, there's some disconnect there.
It absolutely is. Like there's times that I'm actually actively trying to give feedback back to the central team because they don't understand the complexity, the needs that we have developing a web app. So a lot of the stuff is kind of generic, or it doesn't go as deep as it needs to, or we're stumbling upon in the wild like accessibility needs, left to right reading, right to left,
Yeah.
left to right. Theming is a big one, right? So like high contrast. Like the other day, I had to help with input styles, right? Like the focus styles. There's not a clear model set up by the central team. So yeah, there becomes this disconnect between the teams building the things and the ones focused on just, building the best design system ever.
Yeah, and it's kind of sad in a way, because I think a lot of the design community like was pushing for these sort of integrated teams, and I don't know, some of this design, like having separate design teams and teams building systems, and just we'll use the system. It feels kind of like we're going backwards into the like agency world of throw it over the wall, and you get one company that does the development, and then you have another company that does the design, and they don't really talk to each other. They just say, here's the design, the app's done, and then go build it. And then 6 weeks later, you're like, wait a second, what about this screen that we didn't know about?
And in a large org, that team, that central team, they have to go out and basically do user research and understand the people building the products at their own company to be able to then go back and so their thing becomes a product and a project within the bigger company. And so it just we're still building bespoke interfaces on like our projects because we have to. That's just kind of where we're at, and the system isn't mature enough to support it. So
yeah, and I'm curious how that evolves long term, because the more teams start taking a dependency on it, the more requirements will bubble up that are going to be unique, or that you're talking about retrofitting and having to do that. But the more this is the dilemma, because
we can't wait on the issue to be answered.
Right, exactly.
And, you know what I'm saying? Like I can't submit an issue and like be like, okay, customer, wait.
Right.
For 2
That'll be in our 2021 release. We'll be sure to address that for you.
Exactly. And this is the scenario where you have, when you're a framework and you're saying, oh, only one team or 2 teams, 3 teams use us, that's scalable. Once 300 teams start using you, and everyone wants their requests, and everyone has their special like cases that they need to tackle, how do you scale it out? Like you have to do things your own way, because and I think like Matt, you're absolutely right. It's like, it's on our roadmap for 2023. Great. Like what, for like 2 years you're not going to be building something because the team you're dependent on is not building it?
Yeah. So overall, like I think it's just really a complicated situation. And then like zoom out and think about you're a designer. You just got out of school. You're not working at one of these big FANG companies. You're working at one of the other 90%, and everything on your Twitter, everything on the blogs you're reading, all the conference talks are about design systems are the future. If you're not doing a design system, like
you're wrong.
It's unbelievable. You're wrong. Your interfaces will be inconsistent. No one will know how to use them, and that's where I just think this is kind of in a precarious spot.
Yeah,
I think I would, my advice has been when I've talked to younger designers, it's like focus on the thing. I think that you need to have a good, solid understanding of like utility-based frameworks. Like there's utility base, which is great for the engineering team, and it speeds up development life cycles, which solves one of the problems. But then there's also on top of that a scaffolding for visual design, experience design, best practices around like accessibility. That's like a whole different realm to understand and be able to get knowledgeable about, so you can. That's where your real work is. It's not so much on like the front end, like CSS utility side, right? Like I'd much rather have just like a utility based library that we're pulling from to build all our components, and then document kind of our components separate. If it does require like a bespoke design, or we have different needs than, the original framework was designed for. But I think one of the things that you get into with design systems is some of them are built very opinionated. So they have like pre-baked things that you have to start overriding. It's like, well, why didn't we just write our own in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
So Matt, I have the last question for you. We talked a lot about kind of the engineering best practices. We talked about design systems. What's your personal approach to learning new things? right? Like when it comes to building the knowledge from scratch, you have no idea how to use something. Like what are your best practices to tackling that problem?
Yeah, and I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think building something that you're interested in and then doing your learning sort of just in time when you have a problem is what I would recommend, because you have the context, you know what specific needs you're trying, you've got a problem and it needs to be solved. Well, this tool will help me solve the problem. And I think if you just do, repeated cycles of that, you may not have the most intentional learning, and maybe you're picking up things here and there that don't always connect, but you're just building up your toolbox of solutions to problems.
So Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show today. And where can people find you? Where are you the most active, and where can they talk with you?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to chat or tell me about how I'm completely wrong about design systems, and I'm just a mean old developer who hates designers, you can find me on Twitter. It's twitter.com/_Swanson, underscore character, not typed out.
Awesome.
And if you're a developer and you're interested in more of how I'm thinking about building stuff with kind of a boring tool chain with Rails and some of the kind of Basecamp style way of development, you can find out more about that at boringrails.com.
Boringrails.com. I love the domain.
And then your blog.
I was happy to get that one.
mdswanson.com, correct?
Yeah, that's my personal site, and if you care about my more philosophical writings on software, that's the place to go.
I love the moose at the top, the logo.
There's a post in here somewhere where he figures out how to hack a game that I came up with at our old workplace. I forget. I don't know what it's called.
Oh yeah.
He optimized the perfect lineup for basically the Indy 500, and it's incredible. And I use it against people all the time now, and they don't know it. Oh shit, now they do. But it's great. So his blog is awesome. I love it. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt, for being here.
It was a good chat. Thanks for having me.